Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Shogun's Last Samurai Corps, The Bloody Battles and Intrigues of the Shinsengumi, by Romulus Hillsborough, narrated by Eric Michael Summerer. There are but few important events in the affairs of men brought about by their own choice. Ulysses S. Grant. Preface. This book is about bloodshed and death and atrocity. It is also about courage and honor and fidelity. It explores some of the darkest regions of the human soul and some of its most noble parts. The underlying themes in this historical narrative of the Shinsengumi are the extraordinary will to power and sense of self-importance of the leaders of that most lethal samurai corps, and the unsurpassed propensity to kill instilled by them into the rank and file. The leaders of the Shinsengumi, Kondo Isami and Hijikata Toshizo, are among the most celebrated men in Japanese history. Much has been written about the Shinsengumi by acclaimed writers of Japanese history and by former Shinsengumi corpsmen. They have also been widely depicted and romanticized in numerous novels, period films, and, more recently, comic books and animation. In writing this first English-language narrative of the Shinsengumi, I have given precedence to capturing their essence and the main events of their history, rather than merely rewriting the tedious facts of their history. I have concentrated on the spirit of the Shinsengumi and their place in history, rather than on trivial details, particularly for situations in which my numerous sources contradict one another, with disconcerting frequency. The causes for such contradictions are inevitable. Much of the information available about the Shinsengumi is fragmentary. Many of the facts regarding the corps have been lost to history. For example, depending on the source, it might or might not have been raining on the night that Serizawa Kamo was assassinated. While the sound of pouring rain adds a certain melodramatic element to the scene, exceedingly more important than the weather are the reasons that Serizawa was assassinated, the circumstances of the bloody incident, and its historical consequences. As another example, the cause of Okita Soji's collapse during the furious and bloody battle at the Ikidaya Inn is uncertain. Whether the cause was a sudden attack of tuberculosis or the intense heat inside the house on that hot summer night in 1864 is of far less importance than the fact that the genius swordsman killed numerous men with his sword before collapsing, and the far-reaching effect of his sword on Japanese history. In this regard, I must mention that this narrative is based entirely on historical documents and records, historical narrative and biographies, including definitive histories of the Shinsengumi and biographies of their men and other contemporaries, letters, diaries, memoirs, and recollections, including first-hand and second-hand oral accounts and interviews, and other widely accepted sources. However, to the question of whether this narrative is entirely non-fiction, my answer must be a carefully considered yet resounding no. No, because I do not believe that any of my source materials are entirely foolproof, although to the best of my knowledge they are the truest and best available sources on this history. All historical documents and written histories, in that they are recorded after the fact and are not simultaneous depictions of men and events, must be, to a certain extent, flawed. Even eyewitness accounts of events are naturally flawed by biases, preconceptions, and myriad viewpoints, accented by the countless, or perhaps uncountable, perceptions inherent in the individual human mind. Thomas Carlyle, the master historical essayist, summed up this inevitable condition simply but truly. The old story of Sir Walter Raleigh's looking from his prison window on some street tumult, which afterwards 3 witnesses reported in 3 different ways, himself differing from them all, is still a true lesson for us. In this light, I pose a question. Even in this day and age of advanced technology, is there a newspaper account of current events absolutely and undoubtedly free of misinterpretation of human intention or just plain factual error? How could the answer be but no at the beginning of the 21st century, when deception and lies are rampant at the highest levels of government, as they were in Japan during the 1860s, and have been among organizations composed of human beings since the beginning of recorded history? Let it suffice to say, then, that this historical narrative is non-fiction in that my intent throughout has been, to the best of my ability, to present a coherent and accurate picture of the men and events of the Shinsengumi. Stern accuracy in inquiring, bold imagination in expounding, are the two pinions on which history soars, Carlyle wrote. The gist of this message by the visionary historian is that while we cannot know the certain truth of human events and actions which we ourselves have not witnessed, we can, by force of careful scrutiny, depict a clearer template from an otherwise muddled parade of uncorrelated facts of history and embellish this clarified image with fleeting and boundless leaps of bold imagination, to paint a picture that reflects the soul and essence of great human events and actions. This is what I have attempted in these pages. Whether I have succeeded, I leave to the reader to judge. Romulus, Hillsborough, January 2005. Introduction. The Shinsengumi was a police force organized in the spring of 1863 to guard the shogun, quell sedition, and restore law and order in the imperial capital of Kyoto during the upheaval of the 1860s. In this book, previously published under a different title, I have demonstrated how the Shinsengumi earned its well-deserved reputation as the most feared police force in Japanese history. But the Shinsengumi was much more than that. While this book is a history in brief of the Shinsengumi, providing a solid foundation for understanding the shogun's last samurai corps and the complex intricacies of the final years and collapse of the shogun's regime, further research has led me to write a second book that will be an in-depth history and more complete study of the Shinsengumi. While readers of the current volume will become familiar with an array of historical figures, including several of the key members of the Shinsengumi, the focal personalities are the commander, Kondo Isami, and the vice commander, Hijikata Toshizo. Kondo was chief instructor of the Tennen Rishin style of kenjutsu, Japanese swordsmanship. Since I did not write much on the history of the style in the original publication, the following brief historical background, based on my subsequent research, will benefit readers of this book. Readers will also benefit from a brief comparison between Kondo's and Hijikata's practice of kenjutsu, along with a short discussion of the swords that each man favored, both of which, included in this introduction, are also the result of my subsequent research. Historical background of the Tennen Rishin style. The Tennen Rishin style was established around the end of the 18th century by Kondo Kuranosuke, Isami's predecessor by 3 generations, of whose background very little is known. He came from the province of Totoumi near present-day Hamamatsu. After establishing the style, he was based in the shogun's capital of Edo while also teaching in the rural provinces of Musashi, just east of Edo, and the adjacent Sagami to the south. Originally, the Tennen Rishin style was a comprehensive system of martial arts, which, beside kenjutsu, included the arts of jujutsu, bojutsu, staff, and hojutsu, gunnery, among other disciplines. Under Kondo Shusuke, Isami's adoptive father and immediate predecessor as head of the style, students of Tennen Rishin practiced only kenjutsu. Kondo Shusuke's immediate predecessor was Kondo Sansuke, born in the Tama district of Musashi in 1774. Sansuke succeeded Kuranosuke upon the latter's death in 1807. Though short and slight, Sansuke was, by all accounts, an exceptionally gifted swordsman, even more skilled than Kuranosuke. But his career as head of the style was cut short after less than 12 years by his untimely death at age 46. A successor would not emerge for years. Kondo Shusuke was born in 1792, as the third son of the headman of a local village in Tama. Though one of Sansuke's top students, he was the youngest and least experienced of his peers. Having studied the Tennen Rishin style for only about 8 years under Sansuke, he was not qualified to receive Shinan Menkyo, instructor's license, directly from the master. From whom he received it is unknown, nor is it known just when or under what circumstances he became the third-generation head of the style. But we do know that it was no later than 1829, based on the date of an extant diploma of rank conferred by Kondo Shusuke. He served as head of the style for no less than 32 years, traveling around villages in Tama to teach students mostly from wealthy peasant households, and later at his own dojo, the Shiekan in Edo, until his retirement in 1861. Kondo Shusuke established the Shiekan in Ikidaya in the northwestern part of Edo in 1839. The Shiekan flourished, attracting students from surrounding neighborhoods in the city, including the sons of samurai in service of the shogun. Shusuke's student roster would eventually exceed 1,000. Beginning in 1848, Shusuke, with 2 assistants, traveled to Tama to teach at the homes of wealthy peasants to supplement their income. They continued teaching in Tama until around 1857, when those duties were given to Kondo Shusuke's prize student, a young man also from the wealthy peasant class named Miyagawa Katsugoro, who, having changed his name to Kondo Isami, would succeed the master as 4th-generation head of the Tennen Rishin style around 4 years later. Comparisons of the Kenjutsu practice of Kondo and Hijikata. The following brief comparison of the Kenjutsu practice of the 2 Shinsengumi leaders shed light on a fundamental difference in their personalities. But first, some historical background. The great historical novelist Shiba Ryotaro wrote that the original purpose of the sword was to kill people, though during the centuries of peace under Tokugawa rule, it became a philosophy. With the enactment of the Code for Warrior Households of Kanbun in the second half of the 17th century, the Kanbun era corresponds to 1661 to 1673, which included a ban on matches using real swords, Kenjutsu was treated in some respects as a sport. Starting in the Genroku era, 1688 to 1704, many samurai, especially in Edo, led relatively easy lives as administrators rather than warriors, while form and a beautiful technique took precedence over effectiveness in actual fighting, and theory became more important than ability. But with the renaissance of the martial arts after the arrival of Perry in the summer of 1853, many swordsmen shunned form and beauty for practical techniques that would work in a real fight. In this respect, Hijikata Toshizo was very much a man of the times, as demonstrated in his swordsmanship, which, it seems, was more practical than philosophical. While Kondo's swordsmanship was disciplined and magnificent, Hijikata practiced to kill people, recalled Yuki Minizo, who served under both men in early 1868. While Kondo, in contrast to his appearance, had a high-pitched, piercing voice when shouting out commands and a mild manner of teaching, Hijikata, contrary to his usual demeanor, had a rough manner during Kenjutsu practice, which filled his students with fear, said Hijikata Yasushi, grandson of Toshizo's elder brother Kiroku, in an interview published in 1972. Swords favored by Kondo and Hijikata. Both men, it seems, preferred swords of greater than average length. Kondo famously favored blades forged by the smith Kotetsu. In the fall of 1863, Kondo wrote to his student Sato Hikogoro, Hijikata's elder brother-in-law, that he had long and short Kotetsu swords, and that the short sword was 2 shaku, 3 sun, 5 bu, about 2 feet 4 inches, slightly longer than the average longsword, which measured about 2 shaku, 3 sun, about 2 feet 2.5 inches. There were 2 types of longswords, choto and daito, though the 2 terms were used interchangeably. A cutting edge measuring 2 shaku, 5 bu, or greater was classified as a choto, literally long sword. A daito, literally big sword, was over 2 shaku. Regarding short swords, Kondo asserted, the longer the better. His reasoning, it seems, was that in an actual fight his long sword might break, in which case he could depend on his short sword. In the following summer, 3 days after the Shinsengumi's notorious raid on the Ikidaya Inn in Kyoto, he reported to his adoptive father that he had used his kotetsu in the fighting. In the battle at Kofu in the spring of 1868, Kondo wielded a particularly long sword measuring 2 shaku 8 sun, about 2 feet 9½ inches, forged by the smith Munesada and given him by Itakura Katsukiyo, a former senior counselor to the shogun, according to Isami's nephew and heir Kondo Yugoro. In the earlier cited letter to Sato, Kondo mentioned Hijikata's long and short swords. His short sword, forged by Horikawa Kunihiro, was 1 shaku 9 sun 5 bu, just over 1 foot 11 inches, slightly shorter than a big sword. Hijikata's long sword, forged by Izumi no Kami Kanesada, was a lengthy 2 shaku 8 sun, the same as Kondo's Munesada. Hijikata had at least one other, shorter Kanesada sword, currently housed at his eponymous museum, located at the site of his ancestral home in Hino. Forged in Kyoto in 1867, the length is 2 shaku 3 sun 1 bu 6 rin, about 2 feet 2.5 inches. He had another sword of around the same length forged by Yamato no Kami Minamoto no Hidekuni, no earlier than the summer of 1866, the year engraved with the smith's signature on the tang. He might have used this sword during the Boshin War, beginning with the battle at Toba Fushimi in early 1868, according to the Ryozen Museum of History, where it is currently housed. Perhaps the longest sword Hijikata carried was one mentioned by Abe Iwane in 1892, formerly a samurai of Nihonmatsu, who had seen Hijikata at a war council held among the Confederate domains at Sendai Castle in 1868, during the rebellion in the north. In the fall of that year, Abe said, Hijikata, as a condition for accepting the command of Confederate troops, demanded the right to use his sword of 3 shaku to kill anyone who defied his orders. Romulus, Hillsborough, October 2019. Prologue. By the end of 1862, the situation had gotten out of hand. Hordes of renegade samurai had abandoned their clans to fight under the banner of imperial loyalism. These warriors, derogatorily called ronin by the powers that were, had transformed the formerly tranquil streets of the imperial capital into a sea of blood. The ronin were determined to overthrow the shogun's regime, which had ruled Japan these past 2.5 centuries. Screaming heaven's revenge, they wielded their swords with a vengeance upon their enemies. Terror reigned. Assassination was a nightly occurrence. The assassins skewered the heads of their victims onto bamboo stakes. They stuck the stakes into the soft mud along the riverbank. The spectacle by dawn was ghastly. The authorities were determined to rein in the chaos and terror. A band of swordsmen was formed. They were given the name Shinsengumi, newly selected corps, and commissioned to restore law and order to the imperial capital. At once reviled and revered, they were known alternately as ronin hunters, wolves, murderers, thugs, band of assassins, and eventually the most dreaded security force in Japanese history. Their official mission was to protect the shogun, but their assigned purpose was single and clear: to eliminate the ronin who would overthrow the shogun's government. Endowed with an official sanction and unsurpassed propensity to kill, the men of the Shinsengumi swaggered through the ancient city streets. Under their trademark banner of sincerity, their presence and even their very name evoked terror among the terrorists, as an entire nation reeled around them. Historical background. The fall of the Tokugawa Shogunate in 1868 was one of the great events in Asian and, indeed, world history. The creation of the shogunate over 2.5 centuries earlier was the pivotal event in the history of Japan. In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu, head of the House of Tokugawa, defeated his enemies in the decisive battle at Sekigahara, the historical and geographical center of Japan. Ieyasu emerged from Sekigahara as the mightiest feudal lord in the empire. In 1603, he was conferred by the emperor with the title Sei Taishogun, commander-in-chief of the expeditionary forces against the barbarians, or simply shogun. The new shogun established his military government in the east, at Edo, modern-day Tokyo. He and his descendants ruled from Edo Castle, which by the time of the third shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty was the largest fortress in Japan. The emperor, meanwhile, remained a powerless figurehead at his palace in Kyoto, the ancient imperial capital in the west. During the Tokugawa period, 1603 to 1868, Japan was comprised of hundreds of feudal domains. These domains were called Han. Their number fluctuated slightly, but by the end of the Tokugawa period, there were approximately 260 Han. Each Han was ruled by a feudal lord or daimyo. The samurai retainers of each daimyo administered the government of their lord's Han. In turn, the samurai received annual stipends which were calculated in koku, bushels of rice. The rice was produced by the peasants, who ranked just below the samurai in the social hierarchy. Beneath the peasants were the artisans and merchants. The Tokugawa regime, known as the Tokugawa Bakufu, Edo Bakufu, or simply Bakufu, subjugated the Han throughout Japan. Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu bequeathed upon his favorite sons the great domains of Owari, Ki, and Mito. These became the 3 branch houses of the Tokugawa. The heads of the 3 branch houses were the highest-ranking feudal lords under the shogun. By Ieyasu's provisions, in the event that a shogun failed to produce an heir, his successor was to be chosen from among the branch houses. Following in the hierarchy were the 20 related houses, descended from Ieyasu's younger sons. Below them were the hereditary lords, whose descendants had aided Ieyasu at Sekigahara. The hereditary lords were direct retainers of the Tokugawa and, generally speaking, occupied the most important governmental posts, including those of regent and senior counselor. During the final years of Tokugawa rule, there were 145 hereditary lords. The progeny of those who either had been defeated by Ieyasu or had not sided with him were the so-called outside lords, of whom there were 98 at the end of the Tokugawa period. The Yamanouchi of Tosa, the Shimazu of Satsuma, and the Mori of Choshu were among the most powerful families of outside lords. From these 3 Han would emerge the leaders in the revolution to overthrow the Bakufu and restore the emperor to his ancient seat of power. This revolution was the Meiji Restoration. In 1635, the Bakufu initiated the system of alternate attendance, by which all daimyo were required to maintain official residences at Edo and live in them in alternate years. Through this system, the Bakufu ensured that half of the feudal lords would always be present in Edo, while the other half were in their respective domains. The vast expense of maintaining Edo residences and traveling back and forth to the shogun's capital necessarily reduced the amount of money left the feudal lords for military expenditures. Further safeguarding against insurrection in the provinces was the requirement that each daimyo keep his wife and heir at his Edo residence as virtual hostages during his absence from the capital. The Tokugawa ruled more or less peacefully for the next 2.5 centuries. To maintain this peace, the Bakufu had strictly enforced a policy of national isolation since 1635. But the end of this halcyon era approached as the social, political, and economic structures of the outside world underwent major changes. The British colonies in North America declared independence in 1776. The remnants of feudalism in Europe were obliterated by the French Revolution in 1789 and the ensuing Napoleonic Wars. The 19th century heralded the age of European and North American capitalism, and with it, rapid advances in science, industry, and technology. The development of the steamship in the early part of the 19th century served the expansionist purposes of Western nations. Colonization of Asian countries by European powers surged. In 1818, Great Britain subjugated much of India. Through the Treaty of Nanking, which ended the First Opium War in 1842, the British acquired Hong Kong. The foreign menace reached Japan on June 3rd of the 6th year of the era named Kaei, July 8, 1853 on the Gregorian calendar. It was on that day that Commodore Matthew Perry of the U.S. Navy led a squadron of heavily armed warships into Edo Bay, off the Shogun's capital, eventually forcing an end to Japanese isolation and inciting 15 years of bloody turmoil across the island nation. Perry carried a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding a treaty between the United States and Japan. After months of stormy and unprecedented debate among samurai and daimyo both within and outside the Tokugawa camp, and even including members of the general populace, the authorities eventually yielded to Perry's gunboat diplomacy. In March 1854, the first year of the era of Ansei, Japan relinquished its policy of isolationism and signed the so-called Treaty of Peace and Amity with the Americans. Similar treaties with England, Holland, France, and Russia followed. 2 ports were opened, one at Shimoda, not far from Edo, the other at Hakodate, on the far northern island of Ezo. Samurai throughout Japan were outraged over the humiliation they suffered at the hands of the foreigners. The situation was tersely explained by one who rose above this outrage in order to deal with the unprecedented and pressing dangers facing Japan. Since the time that the American warships arrived at Uraga in 1853, public opinion became divided between the advocates of war and peace, so that a decision could not be made either way, Katsu Kaishu wrote 4 decades later, in a brief chronicle of the origin and downfall of the Tokugawa Bakufu. Kaishu was an expert swordsman who never drew his sword on an adversary. He was a philosopher-statesman, founder of the Japanese Navy, and, during those dangerous times, probably the most valuable personage in the entire Edo regime. At that time, the Bakufu decided to open the country, and gradually did so. There were many people, including feudal lords, who resented this. They said that the Bakufu was forced by the barbarians to open the country because of its cowardice and weakness, and that this was why the Bakufu submitted to this humiliation. They no longer believed in the Bakufu. There was heated argument everywhere. People were killing foreigners and assassinating government officials. 2 schools of thought came to the fore. Kaikoku, open the country, was the official policy at Edo. Joi, expel the barbarians, was violently advocated by the vast majority of samurai throughout Japan. 4 domains stood at the vanguard of the anti-foreign movement: Mito, Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa. As close relatives of the Tokugawa, the Mito rulers would never oppose the Bakufu. Hitotsubashi Yoshinobu, a son of the Lord of Mito, would become the last shogun in 1866. Meanwhile, the anti-foreignism embraced by the imperial loyalists of Choshu, Satsuma, and Tosa transformed into an anti-Tokugawa nationalistic movement. At first they advocated Sono Joi, imperial reverence and expel the barbarians, which they eventually replaced with the more radical battle cry Kino Tobaku, imperial loyalism and down with the Bakufu. Choshu, Satsuma, and Tosa were among the most powerful Han in Japan. The Mori family of Choshu and the Shimazu family of Satsuma were bitter rivals, but they had borne a common and deep resentment of the Tokugawa for these past 2.5 centuries. Both had been subjugated by the Tokugawa since Sekigahara. But the rulers of Choshu had fared much worse at the hands of the victorious shogun than had their counterpart.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?